Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. In what may be a record, I'm not sure. No, Chris Darrell probably still has the record, but it's close. We have a guest returning for the third time in a very short period of time. Jonathan Rauch was last on here where he commandeered the microphone to interview me about my refusal to go MAGA. And he is a writer for The Atlantic. He's a senior fellow at Brookings Institute, and he's got a wonderful new book, which will be of considerable interest to many of our listeners, called Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Jonathan Rauch, welcome back to the Remnant.
Always nice to be here, Jonah.
So, first rule on this podcast is when you have an author with a new book, the first question is, what's your book about? So, well, it's the question you want to get asked when you're on a book tour, and
Absolutely.
I would get so pissed when people wouldn't ask me about it when I was on my book tour. So
too many podcasts begin in the middle with, the question about the research. How'd you do the research for the book?
That's right. What surprised you most while working on this book?
Exactly. Yeah, we're not doing that. So this book says that America is becoming ungovernable in very significant part because of the failure of Christianity, specifically white Protestant Christianity, to do the job that the founders intended. And this book is penance for the dumbest thing I ever wrote, an Atlantic article in 2003 where I celebrated the rise of secularism and said, as a lifelong atheist myself, isn't it great that America is becoming like Scandinavia and religion's fading into the background, and religion's a huge source of conflict and extremism, and we don't need it, and won't this be great? And boy, was I wrong. The founders were right. You needed a substrate of faith, and for all kinds of reasons, which we can talk about. And in America, that means Christianity. It means white Protestantism, because that's still our dominant faith. And the failure of white Protestantism, people abandoning it in droves, has led to all kinds of substitute religions which don't do the job. And one in particular, which really doesn't do the job, which is extreme hyperpartisanship and MAGA.
So we're recording this early before your pub date. So we were basically in a realm outside of the slipstream of time. But around the time we're recording this is when they caught the United Health company, insurance company CEO. They caught his assassin. And this guy
his alleged assassin. Yes,
right. They found the ID he used at the hostel. They found the gun he used to kill the guy. So I'm kind of comfortable with taking the alleged out, but fair enough. And then he's on video doing it.
Other than that, we're not sure.
But I mean, I just, the only reason he pops into my head is one, because it's fresh in my head because I was just reading about him. But he has this manifesto, and it's worth pointing out, just in the spirit of, and I know you don't really disagree with me, is that there are people on the left who make politics a religion too. And in fact, that's been, that goes back to the philosopher, Eric Vergalen, who, talked about political religions and all that. And so this is an ecumenical problem in many ways that you're describing, and it's not purely just Christian nationalism and that kind of stuff, right?
Yes, absolutely. The decline of the mainline churches happened first, starting in the 60s and 70s. You're probably old enough to remember, as I am, that when I was a kid, people didn't ask what school do you go to or what's your job. They asked, what church do you go to? And
not on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, but I take your point.
Okay. And the decline of the mainline churches, it was kind of a shocking collapse, really, led to the displacement of all of those sort of reformist energies, the millenarianism, the want to change the world and have justice and peace. A lot of that got channeled into wokeness and leftism. And, there was, for example, the anti-Vietnam crusade. And then coming after that, there was the college movements on the left and the far left. And it has been noticed, and is true, that a lot of what we see, for instance, in what's called wokeness, has a very kind of Christian structure to it. The spiritual zeal, the sense of cleansing, the demand for repentance. So this, yes, I do not mean to suggest that this is a problem of the right. What I mean to suggest is that what Adams and Washington and Madison and Tocqueville all said was liberalism, secular liberalism, is a great thing. It is a wonderful thing. It is an important and indispensable thing, but it is not self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. It relies on a stratum of values that it cannot all by itself provide. And those values are going to be things like civic virtue and tolerance and law-abidingness and truthfulness. And those things, they believe, had to come from civil society, and the major source of them in civil society, they understood would have to be organized religion in various forms, not necessarily the teachings of Jesus Christ according to one particular doctrine, but organized religion. And so they were counting on religion to do its part, to fill in people's transcendent needs. Why are we here? What is the basis for morality? Liberal secularism can't answer those things, and it turns out there's a need for them. So here you have an atheistic homosexual Jew, or if you prefer, a homosexual Jewish atheist, sitting here telling you I was wrong, and that people like me need to be awfully concerned about the collapse of Christianity. First, the mainline churches a generation ago, and now the evangelical movement.
So there are a lot of different places I want to go with this, but since I had it open, it's one of these quotes that for this conversation you have to reference, and you do on page 19. You say, I should have paid more attention to the American founders who, while opposing the admixture of religion with government, warned that republicanism would rely in part on religious underpinning. John Adams, for instance, famously wrote, quote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And you, as you say, you used to sort of write off that stuff as sort of irrelevant, and it turns out Adams was largely right.
Yep.
So I don't know if I've asked you about this before. I feel like I should have. I have this theory that a whole bunch of people, first of all, I think neoconservatism as a foreign policy thing is a huge distraction from the historic role of the neoconservatives, who were basically people who were disillusioned by the excesses of the Great Society or the New Deal, and then they moved rightward. And the original neocons were all sort of domestic reform-minded, policy wonks, and we could check a whole bunch of them here. And so there were a bunch of people like John McWhorter and Jonathan Haidt and all these people who would bristle at being called a neocon, but they are in fact on the neocon journey. And it feels to me that like you have been on you sort of started out more neocon and then more libertarian, and you've been,
I don't know what I am.
You've zigzagged around a very small band of the ideological spectrum, but this argument that you're making, which I agree with, is a very classically neoconservative argument. I mean, this is why Irving Kristol was calling for, the Fourth Great Awakening, and a lot of those guys, were very excited about the possibility of a sort of moral rearmament and all of that, and so I'm just kind of curious, is this a comfortable place for you to be? And then we can get back, because I think we still need to check some boxes on how we got here, but I just sort of am curious about that.
Comfortable. No and yes. No, in the sense that I really am not a believer, and right. I don't want to prescribe belief as a kind of policy prescription, because that's not how faith works. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't do that. Our friend Irving Kristol used to say, he's not necessarily a believer. He's Jewish, of course, but it's good that other people are. And that's a kind of presumptuous position, which I don't like to take. Plus, it's for me, as someone who tried to be religious at one point in my life and just couldn't do it, I just couldn't believe in God. It's hypocritical to say that other people should for my benefit. So that's what I'm trying to actually not say in this book. Mm-hmm. So I go in a different direction than Irving and the neocons. I don't say everyone needs to be a believer for government to work or anything like that. I do say that there are some fundamental questions about life that secularism will never be able to answer. And two of them are, why am I here and what purpose does my life serve that's larger than just being a hunk of protoplasm that will die? And another is, what's the foundation for good and evil, right and wrong? That's more than just some people think this is true. And I do think you need most people need some source of those values. And okay, so here's the second thing. When I'm trying to figure out where support for our pluralistic democracy should come from, I make a move that I don't think Irving did. And I go to the teachings of Christianity. I go to the Bible itself, because I concluded in the course of doing this book and talking to lots of Christians, you can't just view religion as a vehicle for public policy, through the lens of sociology or psychology, or it meets some needs or whatever. You have to look at Scripture. You have to look at the actual teachings. And when I did that, I discovered that in what people said are the three main pillars of Christianity, analogs to James Madison's three main pillars to constitutional pluralism. And I looked at that and I said, by God, Christianity has within its structure, within its doctrines, the resources that it needs to come back into alignment with liberal democracy. So I'm not saying Christians should become more secular or secular should be becoming more Christian. I'm saying Christians should become more Christian.
I mean, I've been on a little bit of. Have you read Tom Holland's book Dominion?
No.
I highly recommend it. I think you would like it a lot. Part of his point is that, and it's not unique to him, but he does a really good job of tracing it, is that almost all of our concepts of, and you make this point in the book, at some point you talk about how there's a difference between being an ex-Christian and a non-Christian, because there's a lot of muscle memory and lag time to a society that still has Christian institutions. But anyway, Tom Holland points out that almost all of our concepts that the sort of secular atheistic crowd considers their new holy of holies are Christian concepts. They come straight out of, the concept of secular is a Christian invention. Human rights, power of conscience, all of these kinds of things. I think you can get to them independently of Christianity, but the simple fact is we didn't as a civilization. And so therefore having a little more respect, even for people who don't believe in the theology of this stuff, seems called for. And yet, the people sort of, not necessarily your crowd, but to your immediate left, they still have a remarkable amount of distrust and hostility for religion. How do you feel how do you combat that?
Well, it's not so much a matter of combating as comprehending. So I'm gay. I think we established that. And I was born in 1960. And I can say without too much fear of contradiction that the most persistent and insistent and often extreme denouncers and oppressors of people like me were Christians. Some of them to this day, continue to say and believe terrible things about us. They were intolerant in many cases, and they were bigoted, and many of them turned their back on us during the AIDS crisis and said it was God's punishment and we deserve it. And I'm also very well aware that much of history's worst episodes of bigotry and intolerance were religiously motivated, and I take that seriously. I think religion, organized religion of all kinds, including Christianity, has a lot to answer for. So when I look at my friends over at, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, or what have you, I understand exactly where they're coming from. The argument I'm making to them is, you know what? We secular liberals have gone too far in that direction. we became, some of us, so allergic to any entanglement of religion with the state, any mentions of Jesus or the Bible in schools, for example, that we overdid it. And we overlooked the fact that there's the possibility of a deep alliance between Christian doctrine and our secular liberal traditions. And in fact, if these things are pulling apart on a day-to-day basis, which increasingly they are, that our secular society, it's probably not going to make it. It's becoming ungovernable. So regardless of how we feel about past persecution, if we care about American pluralism, the American experiment, we're going to have to see about helping to restore Christianity's promise of pluralism.
I feel like we skipped ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
Why don't we go back and just sort of more empirically, why don't you lay out the scope of religion's decline in public life, right? And the consequences. This is very much a civil society kind of argument. There's a touch of Newhouse in here as well. But like, what's the data on all of this? Like, what are the points, as the Marxists say, of praxis, in terms of both the decline of religion, but also the consequences of it as that you can point to some causality on?
Well, let's see. I haven't done that thing yet that people are supposed to do, where I get the index cards with all the key numbers that I want to cite. But first thing is about religious observance. The number of adults, for example, who never attend religious services was about 44 million in 2008, which wasn't all that long ago. In 2022, it was twice that. It was 85 million. The percentage identifying as Christian has dropped by something like 10 percentage points over the same period. The rise of so-called nuns, people who don't affiliate with any organized religion at all, has gone from being a fairly modest percentage a generation ago to being now essentially the largest single group in America. And even within Christianity itself, the biggest trend has been, by the way, nuns. I meant not N-U-N-S, as in Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, people saying they have no affiliation, none. And then you have the nons, and these are people who are non-denominational Christians. And that means that they are not affiliated with one of the clearly organized denominations, which tend to be a good source of sort of doctrinal stability. And America's fast headed for a world in which Christians may not be in a majority. Certainly white Christians, white Protestants won't be. That's a big change. So we are seeing a rapid decline. What used to be happening until about 10 years ago was the mainline churches were declining, but the evangelical churches, white. Now we're talking about white Protestants now. That's the main subject of my book. But the evangelical white Protestant churches were growing. And people said, well, look at that. So Christianity's not dead in America. But guess what? Over the last decade, white Protestant evangelical churches have fallen into the same decline. And in fact, some of the numbers now suggest that evangelicals may be a smaller number than mainline. And they're both way down there at 12.5% of the population each. So all the numbers show a rapid secularization. One of the books on this, The Great Dechurching, says that the number of people who have left Christianity in the last 20 years or so is greater than the number who were converted to Christianity in all three of the Great Awakenings. So this is new, right? We've never experienced an America in which Christianity was in rapid decline and might become a minority faith where the majority faith is nothing at all. Okay, second batch of indicators, which you've heard from a million people, that's stuff like increase in loneliness, depression, anxiety, anomie. All of those things are on the rise. There are lots of causes for that, your cell phone, whatever. I'm not saying that religion is the only part of that, but it is part of it, because we relied on organized religion, participatory religion, not, spirituality sitting at home, but we relied on participatory religion for our community. Often they were educating our kids. They were giving us our sense of community. They were anchoring us in a tradition. They were giving us ritual. They were transmitting these values to the next generation. And often they still do. But those things are a lot harder to do. Those connections are harder to make if those institutions are not there for you. So it's now pretty clear, I think, that the decline of organized religion, and again, especially Christianity, has contributed to those other social pathologies. Okay, and then there's the third thing. You cannot show with any, controlled experiment that the decline of white Protestantism has led to the displacement of those religious energies, that zeal, that fervor, into political partisanship, extreme partisanship, where I love my party, I get my identity from my party. The other party is not just wrong on policy, but they are evil, they are wicked, an apocalyptic sense of doom if the other party takes over. The Flight 93 election, that's, you have to storm the cockpit. Last chance before the apocalypse. Politics has been invested with the same kind of religious fervor that used to be reserved to religion. And this is very dangerous because, as you know, Jonah, as you've often argued, the whole point of politics is it's supposed to be transactional, right? It's supposed to be, people form parties, but not in order to hate each other, not to define themselves, but to form coalitions to get stuff done so that they can negotiate and form coalitions. So the translation of religious zeal into partisan politics turns out to make the whole society less governable. And you see what you're seeing now. So I'm not saying that any of these phenomena are solely attributable to the decline of religion, but I am pretty confident in saying that the decline of Christianity, especially white Protestantism, has not helped and certainly hurt in holding our society together, keeping us governable. Is that enough data for you? Because I've got tons of polls here in front of me if you want.
No. That's plenty. You had some stat in the book. I remember it was something like 85 churches, a bunch of churches close every week in the United States. It was some jaw-dropping number, but I don't want to misquote it, and I don't have it in front of me. But
I'll find it and tell you. The median congregation had 137 members in 2000. Today, it's half that. It's only 65. We'll lose 30 to 40% of congregations in the next 20 years, according to one projection.
I mean, I
only
should
25% now are practicing Christians in America. 1/3 fewer attend church. So yeah, on and on.
I should get your reaction though to the talk about how Gen Z or men are starting to go back to church. At least that's something that a lot of my friends are making a big deal out of. I don't know. I haven't looked at the numbers to say it's as gobsmacking as they want it to be, but have you looked at that? Is that there's this seems to be this counter trend going on? Sales of Bibles going up or something. Anyway,
we hear about this anecdotally. As far as I know, I'm not a religious demographer, but as far as I know, that has not shown up in any big way in the numbers yet. So far, over the last generation or so, each generational wave has been less Christian and more unaffiliated than the one before. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not spiritual, but it means that people, each generation is more inclined to turn to sort of self-spirituality or DIY religions or non-denominational stuff or Soul Cycle or Wicca or whatever it is that they're into, as opposed to the more traditional structured religious organizations. But I hear the same thing you do. I hear about it in Britain too, from friends over there, that there's sort of growing interest stirring in, hey, this DIY religion where you kind of make it up as you go along, that's not really working for us. And that's one of the things that leads me to hope that if Christianity is truer to its own teachings, that it can begin to maybe repair some of the damage.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I look at some part of the point that you're making is, um, um, I'm an anti-Rousseauian in all things, and the sort of Rousseauian, in some ways Rawlsian kind of understanding of the individual and that your identity is, um, that self-expression is the highest good, which we get a lot of from Rousseau, is really bad for democracy and really bad for your soul. And whether you use that metaphorically or literally, the word soul. And what you actually want for a healthy life is it's portfolio maintenance. Is you want different sorts of identity in different contexts. So in your church, you're a member. In your business, you're a leader. On your softball team, you're the worst player. You go down the list of a bunch of different things, but it's like the more points on the graph that you are on, the easier it is to get a fixed idea of who you really are and also feel like a more well-rounded, healthier person. And if you have different sources of meaning in your life, that lets you resist giving over your whole self to any one thing, particularly politics, right? If you have a very well-grounded sense of religion, you're probably not going to let politics consume you in the way that you might if you have no other sources of meaning in your life. If you've got a family to take care of, that is going to put serious limits on the extent to which you're going to give yourself entirely to a job or to a religion or to politics or anything like that. And that's what you want, is you want more roots in different and as diverse a soil as possible to be better grounded. And if you take religion out of the equation, you're messing up the whole thing.
That's exactly right. I'd just add two footnotes to that. And the first is that just believing doesn't get you there. Mm-hmm. There's an institutional aspect to all of these roots that we're talking about. Like you have to do these things with other people in institutional context where there's some structure and there's some expectations. And what is it that people like me in my community are and are not supposed to do? And that's a lot of the strength of all of these institutions and identities. It's that they're not just identities, they're institutions. And another is that, I guess maybe an obvious point, but important to make, everything you just say is true about the need for religion to build these anchors in identity, unless the religion itself becomes partisan and politicized and secularized. And that's a big chunk of the problem, because increasingly, and as many Christians say, alarmingly, conservative white Protestantism has in many ways become secularized and politicized. The promise of religion, of Christianity, but of all organized religion, is that it's different in important ways from the surrounding culture. It's not just swimming in that big sea of cultural stuff and political stuff. But increasingly, the white evangelical church has merged with the Republican Party. 80+% voted for Trump, 80+% voted for Romney and George W. Bush, or around 80. But, those were very different characters. But these days, by far, the most solid, enthusiastic, uniform base of support for the Republican Party, including its MAGA iteration, is the white evangelical church. Jonah, I just came across this amazing, interesting statistic, which is we all know that Donald Trump won the white working class vote, and that Kamala Harris lost, and Democrats lost the white working class vote. It turns out that the only reason that Republicans won the white working class vote is that they won overwhelmingly the white evangelical working class vote. Mm-hmm. Non-evangelical, non-college voters voted Democratic. Now, by smaller margins in 2020 than in the past. But what we're learning here is that the deeper you dive, the more that membership in a white evangelical identity is becoming more like a political identity than a religious identity. And in fact, we seem to be seeing a switching out in the composition of white evangelical churches. People are drifting away, in some of them who are more interested in the spiritual and theological aspects, and people are drifting in who say, I'm an evangelical because I'm a Republican, because I'm a conservative, because I'm a Trump supporter. So when a church gets politicized in that way, that's when it gets really hard for it to do the job that we would like it to do of depoliticizing society.
So talk about the LDS Church. You spent some time looking into it and its role. I actually talked to some of the same people that you talked to. That I was out in Utah about 2 months ago, and they said, "Oh yeah, Jonathan Rauch was out here talking about this thing for this book." That's how I first found out about your book. I felt a little betrayed that I had to fly to Utah to find out about your next book. But how is the LDS Church? Which I also found out from these guys that it's you're not supposed to call them Mormons anymore, but no Mormons actually take any offense at being called Mormons. I think it's a very ill-advised marketing change on their part. Like to take the word Mormon out of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is a bad idea, but who am I? I don't make these calls. So anyway, what did you learn about the LDS Church and its role in these trends?
In order to give that some context, can I backtrack just a little bit?
Absolutely. Backtracking is allowed here. Rabbit holes encouraged. Go for it.
Okay. So I mentioned earlier, one of the big takeaways for me in this project is that you have to understand religion. You have to take theology seriously. Their actual teachings matter. They're not just vessels for whoever happens to be in charge. And it started to seem to me, I picked this up from others like David French and Russell Moore, that there's a big hole in American Christianity, which is that it has a lot to say about making ourselves like Jesus. One of the core doctrines in our everyday life, in our personal life, in our, how we treat others. When hurricane comes to North Carolina, the churches are going to be there. It's awesome. But it's had almost nothing to say about spiritual formation, becoming like Jesus in the civic realm. How are we supposed to treat each other in politics? How are we supposed to treat each other online? And increasingly, we saw this phenomenon that David French calls, well, I may be somewhat of an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen. And the problem with that is that Christian teaching does not segregate being Christ-like in your personal life and MAGA-like in your civic life. You're supposed to be Christian all the time. You're supposed to bear witness and show the fruit of the Spirit in every aspect of your life. But there is no teaching. There's no theology around how do we address politics. And that leaves this gaping hole, this kind of vacuum that both wokeness on the left and MAGA on the right were kind of rushing to fill. Okay, well, if Jesus Christ won't tell us how to address politics, then the Republican Party or the woke movement will. So this is all kind of stirring around in Christian circles and in my head. And along comes this guy named Dallin Oaks, who is the number 2 leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as they now call themselves, and very soon will be the prophet. By the way, you're right. When I went to interview President Oaks, he referred to himself as Mormon. And I said, President Oaks, I don't think you're supposed to do that. And he just smiled. So it's fine. But an inspiration for this book is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2015 did this extraordinary thing in Utah where they led and struck a grand compromise with the LGBT community, extending non-discrimination law to them with some carve-outs for, special cases for religious liberty, like BYU doesn't have to have, married student housing for gay couples or whatever. And no one had done that before. I mean, this is a very conservative church, right? They're against gay marriage. Homosexuality is a sin. You can get excommunicated if you're unrepentantly gay in their church. And yet they're saying, we favor non-discrimination. 2 years ago, they were in favor of and helped pass a federal statute that implements same-sex marriage in federal law, even though they're against it. So I'm watching this and going, what the heck? And then Dallin Oaks gives a series of speeches in which he says that the posture of the church as Christians toward civil society is one of patience, accommodation, patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. And he makes the case that this is not some strategic choice that our lobby shop in Washington, D.C. told us to make. This is what God wants. And he makes the case, as do others in the church, that this is deeply rooted in their theology. It's, we won't get into it, but it has to do with, they reject the concept of original sin, and they've got this concept of personal agency. So they also have, I think uniquely among American religions, their scripture says that the United States Constitution is divinely inspired. So what they're building out there in Utah and in the LDS Church is think of it as the opposite of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism basically says Christians should run this country the way we think it ought to be run. They have Christian constitutionalism. Mm-hmm. They are saying what God wants is actually the same thing James Madison wanted, which is a country where people strive to compromise and get along with each other. So they're actually walking that walk. As I said, they're actually legislating it in Utah and helping to do it nationally. But I look at this and think, okay, so right here in front of our eyes, in one of the most successful churches in America, one of the few that's growing and not shrinking, you're seeing the development of a full-fledged civic theology that essentially changes all the assumptions about Christians' place. They're not supposed to be oppositional. It's not supposed to be our way or the highway. It's not supposed to be a posture of fear and never compromise. And so that for me became an example of how you can find in Christianity the resources to help reestablish democracy.
I just want to get your reaction to this. This is one of my favorite quotes. I'm a bit of inoculophobe, which is someone who's afraid of crowds. I just don't like large gatherings of people. I've used this quote a bunch of times from a pastor and religious writer named Eugene Peterson. He says, classically, there are three ways in which humans try to find transcendence, i.e. religious meaning, apart from God as revealed through the cross of Jesus. Through the ecstasy of alcohol and drugs, through the ecstasy of recreational sex, and through the ecstasy of crowds. Church leaders frequently warn against the drugs and the sex, but at least in America, almost never against the crowds. And I think that there is one of the things that is attractive about politics as a source of transcendence, which is really sort of the problem, part of the problem that we're getting at here is trying to get out of politics what it cannot provide. Yes, it is that sense of there's something really intoxicating about being part of a mob, being part of a big group, right? There are people, we've both known people, particularly on the left, who have been protest addicts. They just love protesting, right? And you now see the big chunk of that kind of spirit on the right. And I think that the Christian nationalism stuff, to a certain extent, stems from this crisis of wanting to belong to a crowd and be part, and sometimes it's just a virtual one in terms of like, virtual mobs, Twitter mobs and that kind of thing. But sometimes it's a literal one. And I think the obsession with Trump's crowd sizes plays some part in all of this kind of stuff. And because people retreat to live their lives through screens, the intoxication factor of actually being part of a crowd gets stronger because they're not part of sort of healthy groups as much as they used to be. And so it's even more intoxicating to be part of a kind of mob kind of thing. Anyway, I was just wondering what you kind of thought about that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Of course, crowds can work in either direction depending on what you're asking them to do. And if you're asking them to bow their head in prayer, for example, and contemplate or listen to a sermon, it's a quite different dynamic. But I'd add to that sort of a counterpoint, which is a lot of what's going on among white evangelicals and also among the MAGA movement is kind of a fear of no longer being the crowd. Mm-hmm. That what you have here is a religious and demographic group which has defined America since the founding. This was founded as a white Protestant country. You didn't even have a Catholic president until 1960. You still haven't had a Jewish president. And this group is looking at the rapid shrinkage of Christianity, so that they believe that Christianity will soon become not only a minority religion, but driven from the public square entirely. The war on Christianity. It's not really there, but they think it's there. And they're also looking at demographic decline as the country diversifies. And they're saying, we want our country back. And Donald Trump and the MAGA movement are promising that. So a lot of this seems to be based in fear, a rational fear, actually, of no longer being the crowd, no longer having the numbers to project your kind of cultural supremacy is too strong a word, but cultural influence that you've taken for granted. And the thing that overlooks, something that I learned from diving into Christianity, is that Christianity has always been, in some sense, a religion of exile. It was persecuted in its earliest days. Many people think its corruption began when it was adopted by Emperor Constantine and became, in effect, a state religion. But Christianity, if you look at the Gospels and if you look at its oldest and greatest traditions, it has never been a religion about dominating the world. It's been a religion about serving Jesus. And Christians need to be prepared to live in minorities, to be persecuted, and to be stronger for that, not weaker. And in fact, Christians, I think, are, and the religion itself is, they're at their most persuasive when they're arguing from a position of exile and weakness, when they're outsiders in their own society. And a lot of Christians are saying that's what we need to go back to, not the desire to have big numbers, big crowds, cultural dominance, politicians coming to us promising that if we vote for them, we'll never have to have another election. That's the opposite of what we should want.
So where you write a bit about the PostLiberals, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule. I don't know. I cannot tell. It's sort of like, that NORAD tracker of Santa. I cannot tell where on his journey Sohrab Ahmari is at this point. So I don't know if he calls himself a post-liberal anymore. But these are these people who think that the point of the reason why Christianity is failing is because of liberalism. And they have theories about how to get rid of liberalism and have a restoration of Christian dominion or something or other. First of all, what do you think of their arguments? But also, I struggle with this. We may have talked about this last time. I really struggle with how seriously I should take them. I think Patrick Deneen is a serious person and he's a smart guy. I think Adrian Vermeule is a serious person and a smart guy. But they have Rusty Reno, some of these people, they have these delusions that they are on the cusp of total victory. And I'm not sure that they're worth much time and energy. But there are other days where I think this is the argument I'm here to have, and I should argue with them all the time. Just what do you think of them in general, and what do you think in relation to the thesis of your book?
So, in general, I agree with you that they're smart and interesting people. But to repurpose something that Charlie Schultz used to say about supply side economics, and there's some truth in what they're saying, but as Charlie used to say, there's nothing wrong with what they're saying that couldn't be fixed if you divide it by 10. That they fixate on the supposed sins, excesses, and self-contradictions of secular liberalism as the cause of all of society's problems, including the undermining of Christianity. They think that you can't, in fact, have faith, family, tradition, nationalism, institutions in a society that has secular liberalism. And that seems to me to be a wild exaggeration for a few reasons, which we can get into. I think actually your work on this your thinking on this is better than mine. So another problem with what they're saying is they don't have an alternative to propose. Mm-hmm. The founders' vision was you'd have secular liberalism processes and some of the ethos that goes along with that. And that would be supported by generally supportive religious institutions. and you'd need to keep those in alignment. And that still seems to me the only way to make things work. Because I don't think that the post-liberals have any idea how to run a modern, complicated, multifactional, multi-ethnic, pluralistic, fast-changing society. And they've never even told us how they want to run it. They just say things like, well, we'll have to recapture all the cultural institutions, as if you can make the left or the center left or people like me, just go away. So they have nothing to offer that's, as far as I can tell, that's actually practical. And then a third complaint I have about them, or whatever number I'm on, is that they want to blame people like me, the secular atheist homosexuals, for the decline of Christianity. And okay, I'll take some of the blame for that, and I do in this book. I say, folks like me need to be more friendly and understanding and supportive of the importance of faith, both to people's lives and to our democracy. But what those guys over there, what the post-liberals are doing, is basically shifting the blame to us for what I see as their failures. Mm-hmm. It was not my fault that the mainline churches drifted away from teaching the Bible and into the social gospel and got themselves politicized and secularized to the point where a lot of people felt you go to church and it just wasn't offering really much spirituality or much real teaching. And it certainly wasn't my fault that in the 1970s, starting with Falwell and then accelerating rapidly under Reagan and then reaching extraordinary new heights under Trump and MAGA, that the white evangelical church turned itself into more or less a functional auxiliary of the right wing of the Republican Party. I didn't do that. They did that. And so what I want to tell my friends, the post-liberals, is if you want to understand why people are abandoning the church in droves, you might start by looking in the mirror and looking at some of the choices that the church has made over the last 50 years and comparing the frightened, angry, embattled tone of what so many evangelicals are saying in public life and what they're supporting, comparing that with the teachings of Jesus. So the three pillars of Christianity that people seem to agree are essential, go something like, first, don't be afraid. Do not approach life from a posture of fear. God is looking out for us and has a plan. Second, be like Jesus. Imitate him. His concern for the weak, his egalitarianism. And number three, forgive each other. It is God's job to judge, not ours. I don't think you see in conservative evangelical circles, in their attitude toward politics and civic life, I don't think you're seeing those three things as the predominant tendencies. And so what I want to tell the post-liberals is look, if the church is going to become just like secular society, we shouldn't be surprised if people abandon the church. Mm-hmm. It's not offering what they need. So that's my challenge to them.
I don't know why it popped in my head, but it reminds me of when Donald Trump was asked what his favorite Bible verse is. And of course he doesn't have one because he
doesn't know what's in the Bible.
Right, but he had to fake it. And he said, there's so many I love. I guess people might not think it's a nice thing to say, but I guess it would be an eye for an eye. And like the least sort of Christian concept, which is an Old Testament one, is an eye for an eye, and he gets it that wrong. Anyway, it's sort of perfect of the point you're trying to make. The only thing I'd add on the post-liberal thing is, look, people like you and me, we really like ideas. We like arguing about ideas. We like arguing about theory. I mean, you're a little more empirical and data-driven than I am, but you're still that kind of guy. And the post-liberals are really those kinds of people. And so they think, if they can just convince people that John Locke was wrong, magically, like a spell has been lifted, the nation state will become this confessional, religious place. And the fact is that most people don't have a freaking clue what John Locke had to say about anything. They don't care. And the reality is that America is a liberal culture. And I don't just mean that superficially in terms of and I don't mean progressive, right? We're using liberal in the proper sense.
Yeah.
But deeply liberal culture. I mean, science, as you wrote about in the Constitution of Knowledge, science is a liberal project in its fundament. Americans, Seymour Martin Lipset, wrote several books about this. Americans are a deeply liberal people in terms of their understanding of the limited scope and role of government. And I always loved the image of Sorob's plan to, like, back when he was talking about, we're going to harness the populism of the Trump moment to pursue an Aristotelian, Thomistic, highest good, religious society or something like that. And I was like, really? So you're going to go around and like explain to bikers for Trump that you're going to ban porn? Like, good luck with all of that, right? I mean, it's just not a thing. But these people think that if they can win the argument to their satisfaction, they'll win the masses. And I just don't think that's the way it works. Is that we have a liberal culture, and that puts huge restraints on what you can do with politics in this country, and that's a good thing.
Well, that is exactly right. The grain of truth, the important truth that post-liberals are getting at is not original to them. Nietzsche said it.
Right.
Marx kind of said it, but Nietzsche really said it, and in a much more profound way than the post-liberals. He saw that modernity, that liberal secular society was ending, gradually eroding the fundamentals of religion. That's what he meant when he said God is dead. He wasn't celebrating that per se. He was saying, look, the Christianity that has held our values in place is drifting. He had the wrong answer for that, which is kind of self-empowerment and weird stuff like that. But so the post-liberals are right that it is hard to run, say, a Christian faith, to keep that going in a pretty aggressively secular world. Of course, it's not new for Christians to have to struggle against the world. That's the whole point of Christianity. But here's the part that's the kind of the bee in my bonnet, Jonah, which is the post-liberals say that the end of the struggles of Christianity specifically, and the embattlement of all that is undermining faith and family, and liberalism is undermining itself. And I look at that and say, yeah, and do you know how you know that? Because we friggin' told you. It's there in Locke. It's in Kant. The founders who we quoted earlier are absolutely clear on this, that liberalism works best in partnership with religion. And in America, that means Christianity. But that means Christians have a job to do. And it's not to alienate people from compromise and from constitutional values like pluralism. It's not to encourage them to lie about the outcomes of elections. It's not to celebrate cruelty, politics as a kind of Colosseum sport. It's not to inculcate fear that if you lose the next election, it's the end of your religion and an apocalypse for society. If that's what you guys are going to do, you're going to undermine liberalism and you're going to undermine your church.
I think that's actually a great place to end this to time, which is such a rarity for me. But I actually have to get to a plane, and I don't think we can improve on that. So, Jonathan Rauch, thank you so much for being on. As I told you before, you have an open invitation to come back anytime you like. The book is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Thanks again for being on.
Thank you.